In a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood, Jenny Vinco, a 79-year-old woman, returns to her modest apartment after a day spent visiting with friends. She locks the door behind her, as she always does, and settles into her familiar routine, finding comfort in the solitude of her home. But on this night, something feels off. A sense of unease lingers in the air, though she dismisses it and heads to bed. As Jenny drifts off to sleep, a figure emerges from the darkness outside her window. A man in his mid-20s, dressed in black, silently pries open her window and slips inside. This man is a stranger to Jenny, but he knows her well. He's been watching, waiting for this very moment. Once inside, the man doesn't hesitate. He moves with purpose through the shadows, his presence a growing threat in the peaceful stillness of the night. Jenny, still unaware, sleeps soundly in her bed, completely vulnerable to the horror about to unfold. But the man who has invaded Jenny's sanctuary, in just any intruder, he is a monster in every sense of the word. A depraved soul whose thirst for violence and terror would soon grip an entire city in fear. This was the first night that Los Angeles would come to know the nightmare that was Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, and Jenny Vinco would become his first known victim. Join me today on this journey where you will learn about one of the worst serial killers in history, one of the most diabolical, cruel, and charismatically disturbed. The story of Richard Ramirez is a complicated journey, full of obstacles, and it does not have a happy ending. This is going to be intense. Let's begin. Richard Ramirez was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas, USA, the son of Mexican immigrants. His father had been a police officer in his native Mexico, but upon arriving in the United States, he had to work on the railroad. His father was an extremely aggressive person, administering severe beatings to both his wife and his son, Ricardo. Richard Ramirez's teachers and school friends noted a little about him. They said he was a very shy, quiet, and withdrawn child. But he had someone close by, almost unknown to others, who would change his life completely: his cousin, Miguel Mike Ramirez. Mike Ramirez was a military man, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, but he had a dark side. He had assaulted, tortured, and executed hundreds of people in Vietnam in a vile manner. You know that the Vietnam War was one of the cruelest and bloodiest conflicts. A good number of American soldiers committed absolute atrocities in the jungle to escape the torment of waking up every day knowing that at any moment, hundreds or thousands of Viet Cong could ambush and eliminate them. Many of those who were in Vietnam returned home insane, with post-traumatic stress disorder, and were unable to return to normal life. Mike was one of them. He spent many hours with his cousin Richard, showing him photographs of women he had assaulted and beheaded. He taught Richard how to scrape a person, how to attack and assault a woman, how to use a knife, and how to commit torture, all of this while Richard was between 9 and 12 years old. During that same time, when Richard was still a child, another possible cause of his descent into hell occurred. He had an accident while playing on a swing, hit his head, and had to be hospitalized. From that moment on, he began to have epileptic seizures, and a terror and absolute fear of death was born in him. The only way Richard found to escape this fear was to go to cemeteries at night. He would spend hours and hours there, contemplating the tombstones, sitting on top of them, and beginning to fantasize criminally about the things he could do to others, especially women. One day, when Richard was only 13 years old and already a regular marijuana user, he was smoking with his cousin Mike, when Mike's wife came in and vehemently reprimanded him for the way he was treating his young cousin, a child to whom he was teaching torture techniques and boasting about the atrocities and mass assaults he had committed in Vietnam. Mike couldn't tolerate anyone, especially his wife, saying anything he didn't like. So, he went to his room, grabbed his .38 caliber revolver, and shot his wife point blank, eliminating her instantly. Richard saw absolutely everything. Mike was found not guilty by the judge, who attributed the killing to post-traumatic stress to his great feats with the American military. He spent only 4 years in a psychiatric hospital and was then released to live a normal life. As you can see, all the foundations of a textbook psychopath were laid. A very tough childhood, a fascination with the morbid, a person who taught him what evil is, and not only that, but also taught him to enjoy it. A predisposition to psychopathy, whether due to genetic traits or the swing accident, added to the fact that Richard moved from marijuana to LSD and other much harder drugs, created a real ticking time bomb that was about to explode. Until recently, it was believed that Richard's first murder occurred when he was 24 years old. However, a few years ago, thanks to DNA evidence, it was discovered that when he was 18 years old and working as a hotel porter, he assaulted and murdered a 9-year-old girl of Chinese descent named Emmy Ailung. He was 18, and she was only 9. During his adolescence, in addition to this horrific crime, he began dabbling in Satanism. He stole, robbed, went to jail several times, and made a habit of tormenting people, especially children. He would abduct them for a few hours simply for his own amusement. I believe that Richard Ramirez is one of the most evil individuals I've ever studied or researched. He was an absolutely malevolent being, devoid of any empathy, who sought only his own satisfaction. The small crimes he was committing during his adolescence, except for the murder of the little girl, were no longer enough for Richard. He increasingly needed to satisfy his criminal urges in a more intense way. Until one night, when he was 24 years old, he grabbed a knife and prepared to start killing indiscriminately. This was the birth of the Night Stalker. On June 28, 1984, the body of a 79-year-old woman, Jenny Vinco, was found brutally murdered in her Los Angeles apartment. She had been stabbed more than 30 times, and her throat had been slashed so violently that she was nearly decapitated. As you can imagine, the killer was Richard Ramirez. Let's take a moment to talk about the Richard Ramirez of 24 or 25 years old. He was an intimidating man, standing 6 feet tall, with facial features that many women would find very attractive. We'll discuss this later, as he is one of the criminals who has had the largest female following of all time. However, at that moment, he did not take care of himself at all. He didn't brush his teeth, which were rotting, and he consumed all kinds of drugs. He had fully embraced Satanism, worshipping Satan, and this devil worship had become one of his main obsessions, along with heavy metal and hard rock, especially the band AC/DC, of which he was a huge fan. In fact, their song Night Prowler accompanied Richard in several of his murders. A few months after this second murder, he would begin a killing spree that would make him the most wanted serial killer in the country. A true terror gripped Los Angeles. It's no exaggeration to say the city was terrified because the murders were continuous, all happening in a very short time. What confused the police was that there was no clear modus operandi. Different weapons and techniques were used. It didn't matter whether the victims were men, women, or children. Sometimes there were robberies, sometimes not. Sometimes there were sexual assaults, sometimes not. Richard behaved in an inhuman manner, like a wild animal. Some of the crimes, to give you an idea of the magnitude and severity of Richard's behavior, were as follows. All his acts were always at night, hence the name Night Stalker. He broke into the home of a 64-year-old couple. Upon entering, he shot the man, Vincent Charles Zatzara, in the face with a .22 caliber revolver. His wife, Maxine, tried to flee in terror but couldn't escape. Richard grabbed her by the hair and demanded to know where the money and valuables were. She managed to break free, but Richard caught her again. Enraged, he shot her and left her bleeding on the floor. Then he went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and began to mutilate and torture her. While she was still alive, he gouged out both of her eyes. Another terrible crime was when he broke into the home of a mother who was with her 11-year-old son. He grabbed the boy, tied him up, and right in front of him, assaulted his mother repeatedly for 2 long hours. Richard threatened the woman, telling her that if she even once looked at her son, he would gouge out both of their eyes, and he swore it by Satan. Finally, he tied them together and left. On another occasion, he broke into the home of a couple. The husband was upstairs sleeping while the wife was downstairs watching TV. He killed the husband, quickly found the wife, tied her up, took her upstairs, and assaulted her while she was forced to look at her husband's corpse. Afterward, he killed her too, but not before grabbing a lipstick from the house and drawing a large pentagram on the woman's stomach. Richard wasn't careful. He didn't cover his face or hide his fingerprints, so sooner or later, his reign of terror had to come to an end. And, of course, a few months after this brutal killing spree, it did. In August 1985, the Night Stalker broke into the home of Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson, killed the husband, and assaulted the woman. Afterward, he stole everything he could from the house. Before leaving, he spoke to her again and made her swear by Satan that there was nothing else of value. She swore, and instead of killing her, to leave no witnesses, even though she had seen his face perfectly, he simply told her, "Tell everyone that the Night Stalker was here," and then he left. Inez Erickson was able to give a detailed description of Richard Ramirez's face and also revealed something else. His breath was so foul that it made her almost vomit several times. That breath belonged to someone with no sense of hygiene, who didn't care for his teeth, who used drugs, and who had abandoned all humanity to become a beast, a bringer of misfortune. The police distributed posters all over the country, especially in Los Angeles, with a face that closely resembled Ramirez's. When he saw one while walking down the street, he panicked and tried to flee. However, several people recognized him, and a crowd detained him, starting to fight and beat him. Richard Ramirez, the terror of Los Angeles, was about to die at the hands of an angry mob if it weren't for the police arriving quickly. If they hadn't, Richard might have died right then and there. Perhaps it was what he deserved. But regardless, that wasn't the day of his death. The police took him away, and a lengthy judicial process began. 3 years passed from that moment until the sentence was delivered in a trial that became a major event in the U.S., almost comparable to the O.J. Simpson trial and full of peculiarities. For instance, one of the jury members was shot and killed while the trial was ongoing. The other jurors panicked, fearing that somehow Richard, from prison, had managed to reach a jury member through hitmen or other connections and have them killed. Psychological therapies were necessary. Several jury members had to be replaced, and eventually, the trial could continue. And what was his attitude while he was on trial? Arrogant, haughty, satanic, aggressive, indifferent, charismatic, elegant, enigmatic. There are many words that could define Richard's character once he was caught. He fixed his teeth, and with his long hair, chiseled cheekbones, and now a viable smile, he began to attract thousands, tens of thousands of female fans who were crazy about him. He received hundreds of letters each week from women who wanted to have conjugal visits with him, marry him, and eventually he did marry one of his admirers. Finally, on September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death, found guilty of absolutely all charges. Did he then die in the gas chamber? No. Thanks to legal strategies and his own petitions, his execution was postponed again and again until he eventually died of natural causes from lymphoma at the age of 53 in San Quentin prison, where he remained until his death, having become a celebrity. The terror brought by the Night Stalker has left an indelible mark on history. While justice was eventually served, the darkness of his deeds continues to haunt those affected and fascinates the minds of many. Though his reign of terror has ended, the chilling story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, remains a haunting reminder of the depths of human evil.